The disappearance of the 7 United States Marines began as a footnote in an internal operations log, the kind of incident that, at first glance, appeared procedural rather than catastrophic. The Marines belonged to a reconnaissance platoon assigned to a joint training exercise conducted in a remote, federally restricted region of the Pacific Northwest. Terrain characterized by steep granite ridges, dense conifer forests, deep fog pockets, and weather systems that could shift violently within minutes. The area had long been used by the Department of Defense because of its isolation and minimal civilian interference, making it ideal for blackout navigation drills and classified movement simulations. The mission parameters were straightforward and, by Marine Corps standards, almost routine. The 7-man team was tasked with a 72-hour movement exercise designed to test endurance, silent coordination, and command autonomy. Satellite communication was deliberately disabled. GPS units were locked. The Marines were required to rely solely on maps, compasses, and pre-briefed terrain markers to reach a series of checkpoints before arriving at a final extraction zone, just before dawn on the 3rd day. Each Marine had extensive field experience, including combat deployments and prior survival training in hostile environments. There was no indication that this operation posed any unusual risk. For the first 2 days, mission logs reflected normal progress. Brief check-ins, transmitted through low-bandwidth burst signals, confirmed steady movement, manageable weather conditions, and no medical concerns. The final transmission, recorded at precisely 2:17 hours on the 3rd night, was short and unremarkable. A Marine identified as the unit's point man confirmed their position and stated they were adjusting their route due to unexpected terrain density. His tone was calm. No distress signals were activated. No follow-up transmission ever came. When the Marines failed to arrive at the extraction site by sunrise, command initially followed standard protocol. Delays in harsh terrain were not uncommon, and radio silence during blackout exercises was expected. However, by midday concern began to grow. Weather reports showed no severe storms that could have trapped the unit. Aerial scans revealed no visible movement along expected routes. By evening, the incident was escalated from a delayed extraction to a potential loss of contact scenario, triggering a formal search and recovery authorization. Within hours, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging began sweeping the designated grid. Ground teams composed of Marines trained in combat recovery, along with National Guard support units, were deployed to trace the team's planned route. What they encountered almost immediately challenged every assumption held by the command staff. The first discovery was not a body, nor signs of injury, but equipment. A field pack was found resting upright against the base of a tree, its straps neatly folded inward as if intentionally secured. Several meters away, a service rifle stood propped against a rock formation, safety engaged, chamber empty, magazine removed and placed beside it. Further along the path, night vision goggles were discovered powered down, lenses clean, battery compartment sealed. This pattern repeated itself across multiple locations within a 3-mile radius. There was no randomness, no signs of panic or combat engagement. Everything appeared deliberately placed, almost staged. Even more troubling was what search teams did not find. There were no blood trails, no shell casings, no torn fabric, no evidence of a struggle. The forest floor, damp and soft from recent rainfall, should have preserved footprints clearly. Yet trackers found none leading away from the equipment. Instead, they observed irregular depressions in the soil, subtle, elongated compressions that suggested movement, but not movement consistent with human stride length or weight distribution. These impressions were too evenly spaced to be animal tracks and too distorted to match boots. Veteran trackers, some with decades of experience, privately admitted they had never seen anything like it. The surrounding environment also felt wrong. Birds were absent. Insects were unusually quiet. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. As the search expanded, command ordered a halt to media notifications and classified the operation. Unmarked vehicles arrived at the forward operating base, delivering personnel from intelligence divisions not normally involved in training accidents. The official narrative remained cautious: missing Marines, presumed lost during a navigation exercise. Internally, however, the tone had shifted. Officers reviewing the initial findings noted inconsistencies that could not be explained by terrain, weather, or human error. The idea that 7 trained Marines would voluntarily abandon their weapons and gear without leaving a trace defied every known behavioral model. Some theorized an environmental disorientation event, perhaps toxic exposure or an undocumented geological phenomenon, but preliminary scans found no chemical agents, no radiation spikes, no seismic disturbances. The forest appeared untouched, yet something within it had clearly disrupted the mission. By the end of the first 48 hours, it was no longer treated as a search for survivors, but as an investigation into an unknown event. Briefings became shorter, more guarded. Maps were redrawn. Certain grid areas were quietly marked off limits, even to search teams. Those who had entered the deepest sections of the forest were instructed not to discuss what they had seen. Officially, the Marines were listed as missing in training. Unofficially, a question had begun circulating among those closest to the operation, one that no one dared put into writing. Whatever took the 7 Marines had not behaved like a human force, nor like any known natural threat. And if it had been watching them long before they disappeared, it had done so with deliberate intent. Once the disappearance of the 7 Marines was formally reclassified from a search and rescue operation to a restricted investigation, the nature of the personnel involved changed dramatically. Standard recovery teams were supplemented, then quietly replaced, by individuals whose uniforms carried no visible unit markings and whose presence was never logged in daily operational summaries. Intelligence analysts, forensic specialists, acoustic engineers, and behavioral experts were flown in under sealed orders. All data collected from the search area was immediately rerouted to a secured analysis facility, and access to raw information was limited to a handful of senior officers. What troubled investigators from the very beginning was not simply the absence of the Marines, but the consistency of the anomalies being uncovered. Each new piece of evidence seemed to reinforce the same disturbing conclusion. The event did not align with any known combat scenario, accident model, or natural phenomenon previously documented by the United States military. A breakthrough came with the review of aerial reconnaissance data. Multiple drones had been operating over the training zone in overlapping patterns, each equipped with different sensor packages: optical, infrared, low-light, and terrain mapping radar. At first glance, the footage appeared unremarkable. No visible movement, no heat signatures resembling human bodies, no signs of a firefight. However, when analysts began synchronizing the timelines across all platforms, they noticed brief, recurring visual distortions occurring at identical timestamps. These distortions were subtle, lasting less than a second, but unmistakable. Trees appeared to bend unnaturally. Shadows shifted without a corresponding light source. In several frames, the background seemed to warp, as though the air itself had momentarily thickened. Engineers initially attributed these anomalies to sensor interference or compression artifacts, but that explanation collapsed when the same distortions appeared simultaneously across systems that shared no common hardware or software architecture. Whatever caused the effect was external, localized, and capable of interacting with multiple detection technologies at once. The audio evidence proved even more unsettling. One of the Marines had been wearing a helmet-mounted camera that suffered partial damage, but retained a fragment of recorded sound. When technicians extracted the file, they expected to hear static or silence. Instead, the recording began with ordinary patrol noise: boots against wet soil, controlled breathing, quiet radio clicks. Then abruptly, the ambient forest sounds dropped to near zero. No wind. No insects. No distant wildlife. A low-frequency hum emerged, oscillating in a pattern that analysts later described as structured rather than random. Moments later, a Marine whispered, "That's not an echo." His voice carried a tension that immediately set analysts on edge. Another Marine responded seconds later, "It's copying us." The conversation stopped, replaced by a brief pause, followed by a third voice stating, "It's learning." What followed defied classification. Beneath the Marines' voices, a secondary audio layer could be detected, faint, delayed by milliseconds, yet mirroring the rhythm and tonal structure of their speech. It was not playback. It was not feedback. Acoustic experts confirmed that the phenomenon violated known principles of sound reflection and environmental resonance. Further analysis of recovered equipment deepened the mystery. Several rifles displayed microscopic heat stress along their barrels, consistent with exposure to high temperatures, yet there was no carbon residue, no discharge marks, and no deformation typically associated with firing. One Marine's wrist-mounted biometric tracker revealed a sudden spike in heart rate, followed by a complete data blackout. Not gradual loss, but instantaneous termination, as if the device had been shut off at the source. Another tracker showed elevated cortisol levels indicative of extreme stress, but no corresponding movement data, suggesting the Marine was stationary at the time. Medical officers reviewing the data struggled to reconcile these findings. Fear without flight, stress without struggle, presence without movement. Environmental sampling teams reported equally baffling results. Soil samples taken from the irregular ground depressions contained trace mineral alignments not native to the region, arranged in patterns that suggested localized pressure rather than erosion. Magnetic readings fluctuated unpredictably within a confined area, disrupting compasses and causing electronic devices to briefly malfunction. Yet outside that zone, everything returned to normal. No radiation, no chemical contamination, no known biological agent. The forest appeared intact, but subtly altered, as if something had passed through it without leaving conventional damage. Wildlife cameras installed after the disappearance recorded animals approaching the perimeter of the zone, then abruptly retreating, often displaying signs of agitation or disorientation. As days passed, internal briefings grew increasingly tense. Theories were proposed, debated, and quietly discarded. Experimental technology malfunction, undocumented foreign surveillance, psychological breakdown. None accounted for the totality of the evidence. What disturbed investigators most was the implication that the Marines had not been attacked in a traditional sense. There was no indication of violence, yet every piece of data suggested an encounter, an interaction with something capable of observation, adaptation, and deliberate control. One senior analyst, whose notes were later heavily redacted, wrote a single line that circulated briefly among the investigative team before being removed from official records. This was not an ambush. It was an assessment. As the investigation moved into its third week, the focus shifted from isolated anomalies to pattern recognition. Analysts began compiling every fragment of data, audio irregularities, visual distortions, biometric spikes, magnetic fluctuations, into a unified timeline. What emerged was not chaos, but sequence. Events unfolded with a precision that suggested intent rather than coincidence. The Marines had not all disappeared at once. Data reconstruction indicated staggered moments of heightened stress across different members of the unit, separated by intervals ranging from seconds to several minutes. This implied that whatever they encountered did not overwhelm them simultaneously. Instead, it interacted with them individually, almost methodically. Behavioral analysts were brought in to study the limited audio dialogue and biometric responses. Their conclusion was unsettling. The Marines' reactions did not align with fear responses to a visible enemy. There were no shouted warnings, no urgent commands, no instinctive calls for support. Instead, the tone captured in the recording suggested confusion layered with forced composure, as if the Marines were attempting to understand something fundamentally unfamiliar while maintaining discipline. One analyst compared the situation to first contact scenarios studied during Cold War simulations, moments when trained personnel encounter phenomena outside established threat models. The Marines' language reflected assessment rather than panic. Phrases like "it's copying us" and "it's learning" were not reactions to an attack, but observations. This distinction became central to the investigation. If the Marines had perceived immediate danger, protocol would have dictated withdrawal, defensive positioning, or at the very least, a distress transmission. None occurred. Instead, evidence suggested that the unit remained in place, watching and being watched. Further scrutiny of the terrain data revealed something even more disturbing. The irregular ground compressions formed a loose geometric pattern when mapped, one that loosely mirrored the Marines' last known formation. Whatever moved through the area had adjusted its position relative to the unit, maintaining proximity without direct contact. Historical researchers assigned to the case began combing through classified archives, searching for precedents. While no incident matched the current case in scale, fragments of similar reports surfaced: unexplained losses during training exercises, patrols reporting silent zones, sensor blackouts in remote regions, and after-action reports filled with vague language and heavy redactions. Many of these incidents occurred decades apart, often dismissed as equipment failure or environmental anomalies. Yet when overlaid geographically, a pattern emerged. Most took place in isolated training or testing zones jointly used by military and research agencies. The implication was troubling. If these events were connected, then the disappearance of the 7 Marines was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a much larger, long-running phenomenon that had been quietly absorbed into bureaucratic obscurity. Meanwhile, those directly involved in the current operation began experiencing unexplained effects. Several search team members reported disorientation, vivid dreams, and an overwhelming sense of being observed while working within the restricted zone. Medical evaluations found no neurological damage, yet the symptoms persisted long enough for command to rotate personnel out on a staggered schedule. One helicopter pilot submitted a formal report describing a momentary loss of depth perception while flying over the inner grid, an experience corroborated by onboard instrumentation briefly displaying contradictory altitude data. Though the incident lasted only seconds, it was enough to ground aerial operations temporarily. The forest itself seemed increasingly hostile to observation, not through aggression, but through resistance, equipment failures, data corruption, and unexplained interference that intensified the deeper investigators probed. As pressure mounted, command authorized a controlled experimental approach. A small team deployed sensor arrays designed to emit controlled sound patterns, electromagnetic pulses, and visual markers, attempting to provoke a response. The results were immediate and deeply unsettling. Within minutes of activation, multiple sensors recorded synchronized anomalies identical to those observed on the night of the Marine's disappearance. Audio equipment picked up delayed echoes that did not match the emitted signals. Visual sensors captured brief distortions at the edge of detection, never fully resolving into identifiable forms. Most disturbing of all, one sensor array recorded a signal that mirrored the team's own activation sequence, replayed back with slight variations, as if adjusted. The experiment was terminated immediately, and the area was sealed off under emergency classification. By this stage, internal discussions had shifted dramatically. The language used in briefings grew cautious, almost philosophical. Investigators no longer asked what had happened to the Marines, but what had engaged with them. The prevailing hypothesis, never officially documented, suggested an intelligence not bound by human physiology or conventional technology. Not extraterrestrial in the simplistic sense, nor supernatural in the mythological one, but something fundamentally other, operating according to rules not yet understood. The Marines, in this interpretation, had not been targets. They had been subjects, observed, evaluated, and removed once their responses were catalogued. Toward the end of the third week, a sealed memorandum circulated among senior leadership. Its contents were later partially leaked, though heavily redacted. One intact sentence stood out, chilling in its neutrality. The entity demonstrated adaptive behavior, non-hostile containment, and selective interaction with trained human units. There was no mention of recovery, no indication that retrieval was possible. The 7 Marines were quietly reclassified from missing to status unresolved, a designation rarely used and even more rarely explained. For those still working the case, the silence left behind by their disappearance was no longer empty. It was structured, intentional, and waiting. By the time the investigation entered its 4th phase, the operational objective had quietly shifted again. No longer was the priority to locate or recover the 7 missing Marines. That goal, while never formally abandoned, had been eclipsed by a more urgent concern: containment of information, personnel, and the area itself. The training zone was abruptly reclassified under a higher security designation, its airspace restricted, and its perimeter expanded well beyond the original operational grid. Publicly, the explanation cited environmental hazards and unexploded ordnance. Privately, senior officials acknowledged that they were attempting to isolate a phenomenon they did not understand and could not predict. The forest, once a neutral training ground, was now treated as an active variable, something capable of response. Access protocols became increasingly rigid. Every individual entering the zone was monitored, logged, and subjected to pre- and post-exposure medical and psychological evaluations. Data was compartmentalized so tightly that even lead investigators were often denied access to parallel findings from other teams. Internal debates grew more intense as weeks passed without resolution. Some commanders argued for a large-scale sweep operation, advocating the use of overwhelming surveillance and manpower to force clarity through dominance. Others warned that escalation could provoke an unknown reaction. The evidence suggested that whatever had engaged the Marines did not behave aggressively, but it did demonstrate the capacity to neutralize trained personnel without visible force. That alone was enough to give pause. A classified risk assessment circulated among defense leadership concluded that direct confrontation, if such a concept even applied, could result in further losses without yielding actionable intelligence. The recommendation was clear: observe, limit exposure, and avoid provocation. It was a strategy born not of confidence, but of restraint under uncertainty. During this period, several key witnesses were quietly reassigned or placed under indefinite administrative review. A search team leader who had submitted an unusually detailed report describing a perceptual narrowing effect within the inner grid was removed from field duty and instructed to revise his account using standardized language. An intelligence analyst who questioned whether the phenomenon exhibited signs of curiosity rather than threat found her access credentials suspended pending review. None of these actions were disciplinary in name, but the message was unmistakable. The investigation was no longer just about understanding what happened, it was about controlling how it was understood. The official narrative remained deliberately vague, emphasizing environmental challenges and technological anomalies without acknowledging their coherence. Meanwhile, the phenomenon itself, or whatever term investigators cautiously used in private, continued to manifest subtle signs of presence. Passive sensors left in the zone recorded intermittent disturbances that mirrored earlier patterns: brief electromagnetic spikes, localized sound dampening, and momentary visual distortions at the edge of detection. These events did not escalate, nor did they diminish. They occurred irregularly, as if responding not to time, but to attention. When monitoring activity increased, anomalies followed. When observation was reduced, the zone fell silent. This correlation became impossible to ignore. One internal report noted that the phenomenon appeared reactive rather than persistent, an observation that carried troubling implications. If it reacted to scrutiny, then the act of investigation itself might be shaping the outcome. In closed-door meetings, theoretical frameworks once confined to speculative research were cautiously introduced. Concepts from cognitive science, adaptive systems theory, and nonlinear intelligence models were discussed, not as confirmed explanations, but as tools to articulate what traditional military doctrine could not. The idea that the Marines had encountered an intelligence that did not communicate through language, aggression, or recognizable technology challenged every assumption underlying modern warfare. This intelligence, if that term was appropriate, did not seek territory, resources, or dominance. It sought data, interaction, response. The Marines, with their training, discipline, and controlled behavior under stress, may have represented an ideal dataset. The most controversial discussion centered on intent. If the phenomenon was capable of non-hostile containment, why had the Marines not been returned? Some argued that return implied a shared framework of value, that human life held meaning within the entity's logic. Others countered that absence of harm did not equate to benevolence. The Marines' disappearance could represent a form of removal, no different from isolating a sample in a laboratory. The lack of bodies, violence, or communication did not reassure investigators, it unsettled them. It suggested a process completed, not interrupted. Toward the end of the fourth phase, a final decision was made at the highest levels. The active investigation would be suspended. The zone would remain restricted indefinitely. All findings would be sealed under classifications designed to outlast individual careers. Families of the missing Marines were given carefully worded briefings, offered closure without explanation. Memorials were authorized. The Marines were honored as lost in service, their sacrifice acknowledged without context. Within the system, however, the case was not closed. It was archived, tagged for periodic review, its status marked with a single phrase that appeared repeatedly in redacted documents: unresolved, ongoing relevance. For those who had worked closest to the evidence, the end of the investigation brought no relief. The questions remained, sharper for having gone unanswered. Something had encountered the 7 Marines, evaluated them, and removed them from the observable world without leaving a trace consistent with violence or accident. The military, an institution built on control, deterrence, and response, had been forced into an unfamiliar position, deliberate inaction. And in that silence, carefully maintained, officially sanctioned, lay the most disturbing realization of all. Whatever had taken the Marines did not fear discovery. It merely seemed to wait, confident that time itself was on its side. Years passed, and to the outside world, the disappearance of the 7 United States Marines faded into the quiet margins of military history, remembered only by their families, a few lines in official memorial records, and heavily redacted documents locked behind layers of classification. The training zone remained restricted, its boundaries periodically adjusted under new justifications, environmental preservation, advanced testing, safety concerns, none of which fully explained why the area continued to resist normal use. For those within the system, however, the case never truly ended. It resurfaced in briefings, in research proposals quietly denied, and in fragmented data reviews conducted at long intervals. Each time it was revisited, the same conclusion resurfaced. The disappearance had not been an accident, an attack, or a failure of protocol. It had been an encounter, one that revealed the limits of human understanding when faced with an intelligence operating outside familiar frameworks of intention and consequence. In the years following the suspension of the investigation, subtle developments continued to raise concern among those still cleared to monitor the archived data. Advances in sensor technology, artificial intelligence, and pattern analysis allowed analysts to re-examine old recordings with new tools. When the original audio and visual anomalies were processed through next-generation analytical systems, previously invisible structures began to emerge. The low-frequency hum captured on the helmet recording exhibited mathematical regularities consistent with adaptive signaling rather than random noise. Visual distortions, once dismissed as momentary interference, aligned with predictive models of localized spatial manipulation, models that had not existed at the time of the incident. Most unsettling was the realization that some of the distorted frames appeared to anticipate movement, occurring milliseconds before the Marines adjusted their positions, as if whatever observed them was not merely reacting, but predicting. This discovery reframed the entire event. The Marines had not just been studied, they had been understood in real time. One internal review, conducted nearly a decade later, introduced a hypothesis that had previously been considered too speculative to document. The phenomenon the report suggested may not have been tied to a single location, entity, or moment. Instead, it could represent a class of intelligence, rare, distributed, and largely indifferent to human activity, except under specific conditions. Highly trained, disciplined units operating under sensory and technological limitation may have created an optimal environment for interaction. In such a framework, the disappearance of the 7 Marines was not a unique tragedy, but a data point, one of many that had gone unnoticed or been absorbed into bureaucratic silence. The absence of escalation, retaliation, or communication suggested that the phenomenon had no strategic interest in humanity as a whole. It observed selectively, intervened minimally, and withdrew without trace. The most controversial implication of the review concerned the concept of inhumanity itself. The report cautioned against interpreting the event through moral lenses designed for human conflict. To label the phenomenon as hostile or benign, it argued, was to impose intent where none had been demonstrated. The Marines were not harmed in any measurable way, they were removed from observation. Whether that constituted violence depended entirely on human values, not on the phenomenon's apparent logic. This reframing disturbed even seasoned analysts. It suggested that humanity's greatest vulnerability might not be physical destruction, but irrelevance, being noticed only when useful, then discarded without acknowledgement. In this context, the silence surrounding the Marines' fate was not ominous because it concealed danger, but because it revealed a form of indifference far more difficult to confront. In the final, heavily classified addendum to the case file, a single recommendation stood out. It advised that future training doctrines consider not only enemy capabilities and environmental hazards, but the possibility of observation by unknown intelligences operating beyond current detection paradigms. The recommendation was never adopted. Officially, such considerations remained outside the scope of military planning. Unofficially, research funding was quietly redirected toward understanding adaptive systems, non-human intelligence models, and perception-based interaction frameworks. The disappearance of the 7 Marines had altered internal priorities, not through fear, but through recognition of a blind spot too large to ignore. Today, the forest where the Marines vanished remains unchanged to the casual observer. Trees grow. Wildlife returns at the edges. Wind moves through the canopy as it always has. There are no markers, no warnings, no signs of what occurred there. Yet for those who know the full story, or fragments of it, the place represents a boundary. Not between nations or ideologies, but between certainty and humility. The investigation into the 7 missing Marines revealed something inhuman, not because it exposed a monster or an enemy, but because it exposed a reality in which human presence was neither dominant nor central. The Marines trained to observe, assess, and control their environment encountered something that did the same to them, quietly, efficiently, and without explanation. And in that unanswered exchange lies a truth the investigation could never officially record. Some encounters are not meant to be survived, only to be remembered by their absence.